Okay, gentlemen, thanks for coming along. Most of you know Jack, but I do want to introduce him as an illustrious old boy who graced my own English class with his presence last year and his intellectual insight. So it's great to have him back. What I want to do at the start is just set the scene a bit, and then it's going to be pretty interactive, however you want it. Jack has got ideas on the text, and fortunately they're not all the same as mine. They mightn't be the same as yours. Feel free to come in anywhere, and it will be pretty organic. There'll be lots of good stuff on the text, but it will be a pretty organic discussion. The first thing I want to remind you of is the three things that you're doing between now and the exam. You're making sure you know the text well, knowledge of text. That means basically rereading it or listening to commentaries. The interpretive dimension of the text means reading articles, exemplary essays, or coming to sessions like this to tease out the ideas, because isn't our understanding now that you know the text pretty well? You've got a pretty solid understanding of the text, which means that you can engage intellectually at a much more advanced level. And it's also good when people write articles, they've done the work for you. They've spent the time, gone aside, got their ideas together on a particular aspect of the text, and they've done it for you. So why reinvent the wheel? That's why I say these articles over here are available for you. And if you don't get that now, or you want to collect one later, they'll be outside the door of my office, in inverted commas, desk with a door adjacent to a passageway in reality. And thirdly, you're practicing your technique. You need to keep writing at this stage, I think. About a week out from the exam, you don't need to be pumping stuff out. But at this stage, still sharpening your skills. A lot of you will be doing more another practice exam. But writing introductions, perfecting body paragraphs, conclusions related to introductions, all that sort of thing is your technique. So the three ideas are text knowledge, interpretation of text, and your own technique. So clearly what we're doing today is we're in this zone of the interpretation. We're presuming a certain knowledge, not that you can't improve it. It's great to just go back randomly to pages or chapters. The chapters are all very manageable except 41, which is longer, so you've got that scope of being able to go back. I just want to set the discussion rolling, and then I'll hand over to Jack, around this idea of existentialism. Firstly, you have to understand that existentialism, like any ism, isn't one thing. It would be better if we talked about existentialisms. Everybody has his or her own take on the philosophy. So, Hemingway has a particular worldview which takes into account certain aspects of existentialism, and they come out through the text. How do we know at this stage, in 1929, what Hemingway is thinking as a younger man about the nature of the world, the universe, all the big issues of philosophy? We look in the text, we see the ideas. So I think there are a couple of key adjectives that keep emerging for me about the nature of his existentialism, which ties in with his cosmology, his view of the universe. I think the first thing to bear in mind is the significance of death. Because in a way, existentialists start at the end. They start at death and they work back, and that influences how they see their own existence. And I think if death is the end and there is nothing after it, then that means two things for us in life. If life is going well, we keep enjoying that and milking it for all it's worth. We make the good moment last, isn't it? And you can see that in Frederick's attitude. If life is going badly, we dull the pain and we try to get it back to a good moment. So that's basically what the mechanics of life are if you take death as the end point. You've got to make the moment last and be enjoyable and less painful, because that's all there is. The moment you have is all there is. It will run out and you don't know when. So that's the first point, the overriding influence of death as the starting point. And the second thing is, well, just on that, you see how prominent death is at the start of the text, don't you? In a way, that's what Hemingway does. He says to you, right, we're starting with death. Only 7,000 died of it. That infamous quote is right there at the start to tell you this is where we begin. our understanding of what it is to try to make meaning out of our existence. And then the other thing that it implies is an understanding of the cosmos, of the universe, and that therefore gives us cosmology in existentialism. And I'll just give you a couple of adjectives around it that I think come from the text, and you'll be able to make the connections. Firstly, what is the universe like, the one that we live in? It's hostile. It does not like us. Secondly, it's random. It has no plan. Things happen as they happen. You get blown up eating a piece of cheese for no apparent reason. You get suddenly made a war hero for no apparent reason. If you break the rules of this universe, which has much more power than you do, it will get you back. It's retributive. This universe makes trouble for you. Therefore, it is vexatious. And this universe paints some things out to be what they are not. And therefore, it is deceptive. In Milan and in Switzerland, Frederick and Catherine think everything is fine, don't they? It's going to work out. It's going to be nice. Going to have the baby, all this sort of thing. But there are constantly cracks through all of this. And they would like to believe that these periods in their life are going to last, but of course they don't. They're only being tricked by this universe into believing that. So it's deceptive. So that's just a little way of introducing this concept, because when people talk about existentialism in the text and they try to marry it with a definition they've read from an encyclopedia or Wikipedia or some other source, it doesn't always match exactly, does it? Because Hemingway's take is a particular one. But all existentialisms have to base themselves ultimately on the fact that death is the end point. All except Christian existentialism, but that's a particular exception we don't need to worry about. Okay, so having set that little framework, I'm going to hand over to Jack now to pick up the running.
Okay. Might I borrow my whiteboard marker? I might be rubbing a few of these things off.
I'll do it for you.
Oh, okay. Well, the doctor here has situated A Farewell to Arms in the context of existentialism, where I would probably like to put into a larger context, which is modernity, or modernism, however you'd like to think of it. Modernism fundamentally is a movement founded on breaking with the past and making itself new. So in order to understand modernity, we have to understand what it's breaking from. The books published before A Farewell to Arms were very rigidly structured. They led to a clear end wherein most of the characters experience some form of closure. This idea is very important, closure. Whereas in A Farewell to Arms, we seem to have a situation that starts off in pretty bad terms. In Act 2, starts to look pretty good. In Act 3, starts to look pretty bad again. In Act 4, starts to look good again. And then in Act 5, seems to end very abruptly before the promised closure actually reaches. And we see that in the end, particularly when we look at the last line. He walks out into the rain. It's so cold, dispassionate. We get the sense of him going somewhere, but not know where exactly he is going. It's very open-ended. We're left with no direction at the end of the novel. And ultimately, if we could trace this to some kind of source, I'd say that we could trace it back to Hemingway himself and how he is writing the novel. In my opinion, Farewell to Arms is almost Hemingway's way of making sense of his own experiences. And in making sense of his own experiences, he becomes quite reserved or ambivalent towards many things. And this is the end. The reason why it's so emotionally cold is perhaps because he's feigning from some inner turmoil inside himself. And throughout the book, we find it very hard to make fixed observations about Frederick Henry, probably the embodiment of Hemingway, actually is. It's very difficult to say what kind of man Frederick Henry is. And this is quite contrary to older movements of literature where characters seem to be very fixed. We could instantly match them up in a word. For instance, Hamlet is the hesitator, Romeo is the romantic, whereas we're not too sure how who Frederick Henry is. I mean, sometimes he seems to be acting courageous, but sometimes he seems to be an utter coward. Other times he seems to be a very passionate lover, but sometimes he seems to only engage in sensory kinds of affection, or he shows a lot of distance towards Catherine, particularly at the end when he looks upon her corpse with no sense of sentiment. I observed that it was because he was just passing time with Catherine, that he never really felt anything for her at all. Well, he convinced himself that he felt things for her, but in the end, it was a very empty affection that existed between the two. But I think that's where I want to start with Frederick Henry, because the fact is we see everything happen through Frederick Henry. And I think that that's what establishes the construct of the novel, something very ambivalent, caught between two sides. And hence, the whole world of Frederick Henry, I think, is constructed in a dichotomy, in that everything has its reciprocal. When there is courage, there is also fear. When there is rain, a chapter later, there is sunshine and good weather. When there is nights of wet turmoil in, what were the mountains again?
Abruzzi.
Oh, no, not the Abruzzi, not the good mountains, the bad mountains. When they were in Act 4, when he was about to make his separate piece. Where were they again?
Well, that's the battle, yes. San Gabriel, the mountains of San Gabriel.
Yeah, around there. Then again, also there's that's a place of extreme despair. Yet there are also the mountains of the Abruzzi, which are a place of extreme
purity.
Yeah, purity and consolation. But anyway, let's look at let's look at Frederick Henry. If we want to, my way of writing an essay is I make a distinction between two kinds of evidence. There are intimations and there are explications. In other words, some things are hinted at, whereas other things are explained very explicitly. So I think that if we're going to divide Frederick Henry into two characters, we should first look at the hints before we look into the clear acts that distinctly place him in two heads. So I think that the first obvious split is the difference between him behaving like a courageous protagonist and a heroic and a fearful anti-protagonist. And I think that this is best explained through the fear that he has of the night. I'm sure that we're all familiar with the times in the novel where he seems to actually seem quite terrified by what's going on in the night. Very early on, there is a scene where he explains what the alcohol does to him. He says that it makes the entire world spin above him in this crazy spiral that, for him, allows him to take some kind of comfort in the night. I mean, I'm actually paraphrasing there. That is very close to what he actually says. You know, all these things that he does mask the night. And we recall that after he's sitting in the hospital bed that evening by himself, that he is absolutely terrified of the night. So we know that there is some agent of the darkness that inspires a great sense of fear in him. But at the same time, we see him display these confusing, ephemeral bursts of courage. I mean, for instance, look at the time when he dives into the river. He puts his life on the line there, and we have this typical war heroic scene of people firing bullets at him as he's moving up a river. And this is quite moving, and we almost develop this kind of admiration for Frederick Henry at that point. But then again, we remember the times when he was fearful in the night, and we struggle to form opinions about him. And I think that the moment that this reaches its absolute zenith is, I'm sure Dr. Barclay's already shown you this, the bit where he starts splitting up his pronouns and starts referring to himself as a we. Now, if you want to, and the direct quote for that is, one example when he says that is when he was floating in the river after he had just made his separate piece. He says, "We were floating along quite swiftly now."
I think it's 201.
Yeah, 201. You know, we were floating along quite swiftly now, something like that. And the reason why he's used the pronoun is because he has genuinely split himself into two. Just as I was saying, how we're not sure what opinion we're making of him because he seems to display very dichotomous behaviour. It's because inside himself there is a very clear dichotomy. And it's funny because if you move just about maybe 5 pages through that, when he's boarding on the train, when he has effectively dropped the soldier side of his personality, you'll notice that he actually uses the word I 17 times in the space of half a page. So, as you can see, and what's good about this is that you can actually use that evidence in your essay, saying that 5 pages later he uses the word I 17 times in a small space. You're allowed to say that. But what it shows is that he sort of mutes one side of his personality at times and then resumes it later on. And then we talk about the shame that he feels as a masquerader when he's talking about himself as a masquerader. Obviously, we know that he is assuming the coward side of his personality, the side that is a deserter. But at the same time, he feels a great deal of shame about it. He's unresolved about it. What we can think of that is this other person that he's tried to forget about, clawing at him, trying to tell him to stop what he is doing and perhaps reconcile for his desertion. So as I said, that's a good way to look at Henry as that's the implicit dimension of Henry as two people. And what we can do is we can sort of take that and look at it in little microcosms throughout the text, so sort of relate it to themes. And I think one of the good examples is how he has this construct of heroism around other people, because that generally says a lot about how he feels about the war. We all recall his encounter with Gino, I hope. Gino is a pivotal character. He is the true patriot, however you like to say it. And there's a sense of I couldn't cite exact examples, but you can look at the page. There's a very clear sense of warmth and camaraderie and admiration that Lieutenant Frederick Henry feels towards Gino, implying that he does see some kind of merit or believes that these war heroes do have something admirable about them. But then a few chapters earlier, we have the encounter with, is it Ettore?
Ettore,
who he considers, he was a true war hero, I think the quote was, and he considers him just the most slimy, disgusting character he's ever encountered. A man who has this material manifestations of courage, being medals. Yet, what he says is, "I shot the bastard." Like he's claiming some great victory. Yet, from memory, I think that man was wounded or something like that, or in a situation where he couldn't shoot back.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So once again, he's also on the fence about how he feels about war. And in another way of feeling on the fence, we have how he reacts with Catherine. Now, this is a big one. I was quite convinced that between Catherine and Frederick Henry, there was a huge sense of distance. We saw it early on, that in the early stages of their relationship, that there wasn't something bright about it. We knew they literally called it a game, and we have that notion of using Frederick Henry as a surrogate lover. Catherine using Frederick Henry as a surrogate lover for her deceased partner, the one that died in the Battle of the Somme. And we can see how Catherine's actions are largely determined by what she would like to have done to her husband, to her deceased fiancé. For example, she seems quite ready to supply Frederick Henry with a great deal of sex, and as Dr. Barclay made a very keen observation last year, one single line that you miss so easily when you read the book is a bit where Catherine is lamenting her fiancé, and she says, he could have had it all. I could have given my body to him. And, that maybe, and particularly when she's asking that he does all these things, like say that he'll never go away, offer more than a fiancé could offer, that she really is just playing him. And Frederick Henry does the same thing. I mean, we can almost put Catherine as something that's just a little bit better than the girls at the Villa Rossa. I mean, he literally says that when he's talking about Catherine. He says he didn't like the girls at the Villa Rossa because it felt very cheap. The way that they sat on your lap and they were friendly, and they took your cap off and they put it on their head.
So and that's page 18, the reference to Catherine. They could have had it all. But with that, well, perhaps we just take the question there, Alex.
I was just going to say, could you make the connection that because Catherine never had sex with her fiancé, and she jumped into it pretty quickly with Henry, could you say Catherine realised life's pretty short, I want to make the most of it, so the next man she sees, she's willing to offer herself up so quickly?
Yeah, that's another way to look at it. Once again, as I said, this text is so ambivalent and so divided that you can literally shape it to say whatever you want.
It's an important consideration, is that the way Catherine comes into the text, Catherine comes in with what we call post-traumatic stress in lots of ways, wouldn't we? And a huge void in her life that she has to fill immediately. And she has the particular strategy. And in this whole ironic first meeting, of course, it's Rinaldi who thinks he's got Catherine in the dialogue and the banter, isn't it? And so why does he take Frederick along? It's so Frederick can observe the new person, the new woman that Rinaldi has found for himself. But ironically, of course, that's the introduction to this relationship. And the need, and don't forget the wartime context, isn't it? That these people are not living in civilian time. These people are living with the proximity of death much more obvious to them. So yes, they've got to move more quickly, and it's part of the link between war and the existential condition. But the moment becomes all the more precious because you're more aware that it could dissipate rapidly. And war and love both put you on the edge of human experience. So your keenness and your awareness of the proximity of the end, remember I talked at the start about death being the starting point, that becomes much keener. So I think that whole thing of the way Catherine comes into the text, her need and Frederick's need, is very interesting to analyse, but it's also very reflective of the deeper ideas in the text.
Okay. Oh yeah, and if back on my old point, if you wanted to extend that discussion a little bit further, and if you're like me, you want to say that they never actually, they never actually completely submitted themselves to each other at all. You've got some just good little bits of evidence here and there. I mean, there's a real threshold between Catherine and Frederick. Most of the time, if you look through their romantic conversations, it's idle discourse and word games. In fact, if I could relate it to anything, their romantic discussions, I would say it's a lot like listening to Waiting for Godot. It's they tend to do things like repeat each other and then perpetuate these funny little word tricks or have silly little intimate jokes with each other. The conversation doesn't really seem ever very deep or personal. Yet there was one time where Catherine really states her ground, states difference from, there's a few times from Frederick. One of those times is the night where she says, "I'm not your whore." She's very much drawing the line there, saying that she's not going to accept a part of Frederick Henry, or drawing the line between their affection. But it's most prominently explicated when she's on her deathbed and she says, "Don't touch me." When Frederick is about to lay a hand on her. I mean, don't touch me. She wants to die on her own. She doesn't want her life to be thought of as, died as loving partner or loving wife of Frederick Henry. And perhaps this is why, also one of the more subtle reasons why she never wanted to get married. We can think of it like that too.
It's also like in the existential realm, it's also that aloneness. Because ultimately that's the thing, isn't it? In this universe is a place where you are ultimately alone. You can marry somebody, you can have a relationship, you can go to war, you can do all sorts of things you think are important. But in the end, what are you left with? Yourself and the universe that doesn't like you.
Yeah.
Do you think that's also somehow like her being angry at him for getting her into that situation?
Oh yeah, she is probably really angry at that too. Yeah, she'd be infuriated. But if she really loved him in the way that, you know, Juliet loves Romeo, yeah, I don't know, maybe she wouldn't be as frustrated. Yes?
Is that sort of the same instance when like they're talking to each other in that sort of stickermythic way, you know, keeping up this false harmony, you know, in their relationship, and she says, but life isn't hard to manage when you've nothing to lose. So she sort of brings that reality back into the conversation, I suppose.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, that's a great quote. Definitely try to slide that into whatever topic you get.
I was going to ask, so with the perception that they never really fully committed to each other, would you suggest that when Frederick gets drunk and then he says, he forgets to see her and says, I felt lonely and hollow?
Yeah, I felt lonely.
Would you suggest that is sort of, he feels lonely and hollow because of that sexual connection, or like
no. When he says I felt lonely and hollow, it's just what when Frederick feels lonely and hollow, there is space all around him, sheer negative space. And when he's with Catherine, she gratifies his need to have that space filled, that emptiness. She's just like some, you know, essentially she's just filling the void. But it does say a selfish interest. You know, he's not saying I want the sound of Catherine's voice, or I want to feel Catherine next to me, or anything like that. No, what he's saying is I just felt lonely and shit, and I wish someone was around next to me so I could stop feeling like that.
And that's why he says, I believe in sleep, when Count Greppy asks him, because he doesn't believe in his love for Catherine, he believes in sort of getting laid.
Yes, that's exactly
What do you believe in?
Like when you say that she's just sort of filling the void, when she says "Don't touch me" at the end of the thing, could she say that she's obviously resigned to the fact that she's going to die, but that like there's a sort of change in her character in the sense that she just doesn't care about being alone anymore?
No, that's exactly it. The only problem is there's no way to prove this. The only way that we can do it is by inference. Like there's no real clear evidence that says this, but we have enough intimations throughout the text to suggest that it is probable. So you'd want to do a lot of groundwork before you got up to that bit in your paragraph.
Yeah.
So just put, and up the back there. But
Well,
I think
just
I've done
before
that.
we do, so remember that's connected to how well you create your case, isn't it? So you can have a variety of interpretations, as Jack's saying, or inferences around the text, but how well can you use your text to contextualize the particular interpretation you have? And a lot of the textual references are deliberately ambiguous. So, you know, this whole thing even that we've touched on, what is the nature of the love between Frederick and Henry is the foundational question, isn't it? What type of love is it? Is it real? Because lots of people argue that, you know, if you read, please don't read it, the Cliff Notes introduction to this, it's pretty horrifically a love story context that it sets up, and it calls it a tender love story. I don't find any tenderness in it at all. So how you construct your interpretation, though, is going to depend on which bits of text you take and how you read them. Like, what are the great romantic moments in the text? Where is this tenderness? Well, I can't find it. Some people think they can. I can only find the sort of thing that Jack is talking about, the distance, the irony, the surrealism, the fracture, the false premise. All I can find are the things that are wrong with it ultimately, and therefore I know from the start that it can't work. Because firstly the foundation is cracked with this whole thing of them using each other in a game, isn't it? So it's built on a false premise or on a cracked foundation. It's going to topple in the end. It can't work.
Just up the back there.
Would you say rather than true love, it's more a mutually beneficial relationship?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's what did I say? It's symbiotic sensory gratification, and some word like that, or symbiotic gratifying.
He used to flash these in his essays all the time.
Yeah, I had a few phrases, power phrases. Get a few of those going, they're fun. You can use jargon in high school, you can get away with it. Anyway.
How would you refute something then? Like,
refute? Yeah. Okay.
Something like you know how he rose her to Switzerland.
Yeah.
And the priest's definition of love is to serve.
Yeah, I know. To serve someone you want to
Yeah.
serve, something you want to do things for.
And then also like
And you
the
love it.
gaps as well at the end, like giving her. How would you like go against that sort of thing in an essay then?
You could be. The only problem is here. This is where you're leaving the scope of an essay that you can do in the English exam. I mean, the thing about Hemingway's characters is that they're so vivid that they come to life, and that's mainly because I think he's writing them from experience. And what I think is that something stupid, like a love like what they have, is enough to be sort of caught up in this ephemeral sensation of love, but not real love. And I mean, of course they would do things like that to each other, because Hemingway, when he was writing this, was probably thinking, maybe we really were in love. But then when he gets up to the end, he's just like, nah, I was under some delusion. But listen, you could quite easily refute that. Refute what I'm saying with that evidence. I mean, you've got more than enough than you need. I'm taking this reading because it gives you a few levels. Like, if you've got 2 levels in your essay, like if you've got the top level of the book, the plot, and then you've got the implicit meta-narrative, I've heard scholars call it before, going under the bottom, you get a really sort of nice, deep essay. Well, an impression of depth, and to be honest, you're just trying to provide an impression of depth.
Well, that's right. And when you think about it, you've got only 800 to 1,000 words generally to do that if you write a solid essay. So you've got to be reasonable about what can be explored. But you've also got to keep coming back to, on the question of interpretation, what is Hemingway trying to say, which is the views and values part of the text, isn't it? And I might find, for example, that Frederick is no hero for me when I read the text. I might find that. But I've got to ask, how is Hemingway presenting him as a code hero? Because this is, a key concept in the text, isn't it? And I have to be able to appreciate that. I can deconstruct it a bit, but in an essay at VCE level, that's really thesis territory. In an essay at VCE level, you've got to stick to the main ideas, and then, as Jack says, in the more sophisticated essays, you can get underneath some of them and behind them, and you can show the construction awareness, the views and values.
Sort of trace a causal logic, if
exactly,
anything.
Yeah. But you've got to also be aware that what Hemingway intends is important, and that we can be dismissive, or I can be dismissive, as I often am, about the nature of that relationship, and the fact that I find, Frederick basically one-dimensional and not very credible. I could talk about that from my point of view, but what is Hemingway trying to do with that character? He is trying to put out somebody who's battling the universe. He is putting out a code hero who encounters adversity, encounters challenges, and has particular strategies for engaging them. And remember, I think some of you have heard me say before that getaway hell on, I think it's 283, is the final point. That's really the decisive proof that he is a code hero. Because when he sees the worst possible thing he could see, which is death staring him in the face, does he run away? No, he doesn't run away. He takes it on, and he tells it to get away, which I think is extremely decisive in the concept of the code hero. So there's that dimension of it. And then you've got to come to terms with the section that Jack was mentioning before about the river, how heroic or cowardly all of that is. And, you can construct cases in various directions, can't you? Is it pure convenience to desert? Or is there some courage in doing it because it means taking a huge risk? Is the jumping into the river more or less spontaneous because the circumstances don't allow him to be reflective and make a decision? There are all these sorts of questions that you have to come to terms with in respect of those passages, but always with keeping in mind the stance that Hemingway is taking when he writes it.
Okay. Listen, on that note, I feel like we've sort of aired this construct of Frederick Henry enough. So what I want to go on to next is probably the other biggest thing in the book, war. War is a big deal in A Farewell to Arms because it is a war novel. I suppose. Or some people figure it as a romance bound in a war novel. I think of it more as just a war novel, to be honest. But where I want to start with this is, I'm sure that, war is Hemingway's grand metaphor for life, or is it's a theatre of life, something like that.
Well, the grand metaphor is something that I push very strongly.
Yeah, the grand metaphor, that's a good one. And the only problem is we can say, yeah, whatever, war, grand metaphor for life, whoop-de-doo. Unfortunately, we need to prove it, and that's that's not as easy. What I do is I sort of I found a few hints. So, in the terms of the two kinds of evidence I was talking about here, the war being a grand metaphor for life definitely hinges on implicit evidence or intimations throughout the text. And I think the best way to do that is to look at what the war actually has. And there is this emphasis on infinite continuity first. And the idea that the war will actually go on forever. And there's been a bit of there are a few conversations Frederick has where they literally say those things. You know, they say that this war can't be won. You know, in other words, it will just rage on forever. And there was another person who said there is no finish to a war. You know, the war is something eternal. It's our battle. Yeah, question?
I think even Frederick himself is so unsure about like the reality of the end of something that's obviously so has such a long continuum that like
Yeah.
He even says like maybe like the war can't go on forever. It can't always go on. And then he says, oh, maybe it'll be another 100-year war.
Yeah, maybe it'll be another 100-year war.
Like,
That's a good one.
It could be a good year this year, or maybe it'll be a bad year. And he says it in the same sentence. Like he has no idea, yet he still wonders.
Yeah. So then what I do after that is, okay, so we've got this idea that war goes on forever, which is a lot like life. But then we just strike a few comparisons to the lives of the characters and how much they resemble this war. I mean, the idea of the enemy, the other, on the opposition, we can talk about them and what they're fighting for, and then relate it to how Frederick is fighting, you know, his sense of other, I might say, you know, the other side of his personality, or
that's the internal battle.
Yeah, the internal battle. So you relate it. You know, you've got a pretty clear connection there between. Well, listen, it's not that clear of a connection, but it's clear enough. It's clear enough for an English essay.
Could you also say that he's sort of fighting the sort of powers of the universe almost?
The powers of the universe. So the internal battle and the powers of the universe. So yeah, that gives you actually more than enough evidence to connect them all up. So after this, what do we have? We have war as the grand metaphor for life. Well, what are the qualities of war? How are we made to feel about the war in A Farewell to Arms? And this was the question that we had on the exam last year. What was it that A Farewell to Arms is essentially an anti-war novel?
Yes.
Was that it? How do I remember that? But
you wrote on it.
Yeah, I did write on it, and I'd written that essay like 3 times. All practice exams had the same question on it. That question ended up being on the exam.
Yes, so you fluked it. Well done.
Yeah, I know, I did fluke that. But anyway, what did I want to say about the war again? So I think that the main point about it is we very early get this impression that the war is something completely absurd. And it's almost comical how absurd.
Surreal, in fact.
Yeah, yeah. But did I have a point about that somewhere? Oh yeah. No, listen. We all have the typical evidence that Dr. Barclay was talking about before, about what the war actually does. About the war being absurd, with the blown up while eating cheese, and being shot by your own guys when they're running away. Was it with Gavuzzi all there towards the end? When
Amo.
Yeah, Amo. Yeah, and they're being shot by their own guys, so they're under more damage. They're under more threat to their own team. If you want a good other text to look at to get an idea of that, I'd recommend Apocalypse Now, because there's a real sense of that in Apocalypse Now. And I suppose there's some other bits of evidence that you'd want there. Oh yeah, there's also a string of words. Now listen, in A Fair Order Arms, I loved strings of words, little patterns of language that appear in the text. Because it was really great. What you could say is, at the start of your paragraph, you could make a claim, war is absurd. Then you could say, there are little hints here and there in the language, a few words that pop up throughout the text, which were pointless, horrible, rotten, terrible. They all say that the war doesn't have any real objective, any real conclusion. And from that, you sort of set yourself up for the big explicit statement, the bit of evidence that you analyse to say, but this really is the case. And in there, that's when I'd launch into the instances in which we really see war as being something absurd. And that was the cases that I listed before. And I think that I'll also put in another reference to the infinity thing there, how it's absurd because it doesn't end. It's absurd because you get shot by your own guys. It's absurd because you don't get injured while you're in battle. You get injured while you're eating cheese. But
and then you get a medal for that.
And yeah, you get a medal for that. That's a great one. You get the medal is so important. Medal, I think, is the most important motif in A Fair Order Arms. But that's my opinion. I understand many would refute that, but even though they don't even pop up that much. But after that, I think another great point to talk about is what is the war in terms of its aesthetic. And I say that the war in Fair Order Arms, we very rarely see it. It's always in the mountains, or over the other side of the mountains, or you could hear shots firing in the distance. That's the war. It's always something that's away. But in the rare cases that we actually do confront the war, we see how the landscape or the action completely contradicts all the other landscapes of the novel. For instance, when Henry gets injured, he makes that comment looking down, or when he runs his hands down his legs, he says, I went down to feel my knee and it went in, which means that my hand actually managed to find its way into a mess of maimed flesh. And when you see that line, it went in, it conjures imagery. You are forced to imagine. Well, actually, here's a good one. I mean, one of the great things about high school is that if you get this line in, that your reader isn't something fixed, you get a really good bit of analysis. So in this situation, when they say it went in, obviously we're young men, so we're a little bit more up to it than the average reader. But we imagine literally a hand moving into flesh. Whereas if he had described that, he had said, and then he plunged his hand down and looked down, and before he knew it, there was a mess of red flesh and all that kind of stuff. It puts distance between it. It's boring. We read it on the paper, but we don't put it into our heads as vividly as when he says, it just went in. So that's the extent of gruesomeness that we have on the battlefield. He's literally prompting us to imagine these terrible things. Or alternatively to that, you could say that some people, the squeamish, would read that phase and instantly try to forget about it because they don't want to think of the imagery. And that's also, the end of it is that Hemingway is really playing with us to get this intense, vivid sense of fear and just the abject on the battlefield.
And also, this is a good point for tying into literary style, isn't it? This is where you would make your construction observation about the minimalist language, which functions at a number of levels. Ultimately, I think the minimalist language ties in with the existential agenda that everything reduces to nothing in the end. And you get all of that nada speak, as I call it in chapter 41, all of that nothing language. But it also operates as a technique, as Jack is saying, that you would know as the iceberg technique, where because you're given only the tip of the information, you have to do the rest. And it's actually very engaging for a reader. And it also ties in with what Jack was saying about the unconventional nature of modernist writing, because as you would know from having done Dickens, the emphasis is on the writer giving you heaps of detail, isn't it? And controlling what you're reading and telling you the picture. So the writer controls. But the interesting thing about some of the modernists like Hemingway is that they hand over a certain amount of the interpretation of their text to the reader quite willingly, quite readily, and with an awareness that they're doing that.
Or in parody, they over-describe, like Virginia Woolf.
Yes, okay, so other modernists use the technique differently, but in this instance, this is how Hemingway is using it. So the construction observation there would be important. And you know, guys, if you want to distinguish yourselves, this construction dimension is going to be significant.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, we've got the war scene, something that's bloody and pretty damn terrifying, but I think that Hemingway does a really elegant job of platforming with his other landscapes. Like, I seriously recommend memorizing the entire first sentence, because that establishes the first scene or the first view we get in A Farewell to Arms. And I'll just read it now to refresh your memory. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. And it sounds quite it sounds quite flat in a way, but if you read it enough times, it's got this hypnotizing, very beautiful effect to it that airs this intense sense of stillness, like someone passing a camera over a panoramic view. And I seriously recommend teasing out one of these sentences, because there's a lot to analyse here. Yep, go on.
How do you understand that, like, we sort of thing? Like, who do you see as the we?
The we.
Yeah.
Us reading the text.
As in, like, we lived in a house.
Oh, we lived in a house. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, I'm not really talking about... the we... No, I don't know who the we is. It's probably just him and his army mates.
But I think the other thing too about it is, all of this is deliberately imprecise, isn't it? He's not giving you dates, he's not giving you detail. This contrasts too with the accuracy of the geographical detail, but that's another discussion. He gives you this almost what I think is a fairy tale mythological start, where it's very painterly, it's very impressionistic. He's not interested in detail, and the impressionism goes with the modernist style, doesn't it? And we might get Jack, actually, because of his sort of fine arts background, and because of an article that influenced him a lot last year, to talk a bit more. I think you're coming to it.
Yeah, I am
the
coming
still
to
life.
it.
So that's a good entry point. But yes, it's a very significant start in the way that it's expressed in language.
So what I'm going to do is we're going to tease this sentence out, because I can happily tell you guys, yes, this sentence has stillness, but I'm not telling you why it has stillness. The reason why it has stillness lies in the way that it's constructed. If you read it, I don't think there's a word longer than 2 syllables. And in doing this, each word sits very starkly and discreetly. Well, not quite discreetly, but they have a sense of being their own, and hence when you read them, they all seem to stand apart from each other, which ultimately airs this sense of stillness from separation. And moreover, we can see that that's the way that the sentence is constructed too, in these funny little bites. I mean, it could actually be written out in poetry, like lines of poetry before it was done, because the way we read it is, if you read it out loud, it's, in the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. So see, like, these couplings of 3 words, how it makes it read so slow. But at the same time, because it does have that sense of slowness, it has that elegant little cadence about it that intimates the beauty of the landscape, or that you're looking across something very vast. And I think this is important, because if you pick up on these little construction issues these little construction hints in the text, you get a real intimate understanding of what's happening, or you feel the motion of it. The motion is very important. Before when I was talking about the instance where he feels the main flesh on his knee, you read that entire phrase and it's written in stream of consciousness with a very different kind of register. Much longer couplings of words which cause your eyes to go quickly from one word to another, and to read it like it's all happening over some wild flush of excitement and energy. And hence it seems so fast, it seems so intense, it seems so privy, whereas this vast landscape that we saw at the start seems so still and peaceful. And I think if you talk about this sort of stuff, you get a different idea of what landscape Hemingway is painting in the novel at particular times. And that is probably the highest level of construction analysis that you can do. I mean, that's like analysing phonetic patterns that's a big deal.
and also that will fit within the context of the word limit and the task that they're doing.
Yeah, because you've got enough room. So if you want to... So?
Just do that one more time. If that, like the still moment. Is that the idea that you want explained a bit more?
The still moment. Okay. So how the still moment is created in this first sentence. Okay. So essentially what we'd say is we'd probably say that in the first sentence there is a sense of stillness. We'd put some nice little colons at the end of that sentence. Then we'd write the sentence down. And then we'd explain how each of the words don't have many syllables, which in themselves makes the words kind of stand on their own. And then we could say how the way that the sentence is constructed between very, very small clauses, that causes little groups to emerge in the sentence, which makes it read very slowly and slightly disjunctively, but not enough for it to actually affect the way that we're viewing the landscape. And ultimately, this airs a sense of intense stillness, and with stillness comes vastness. You know, that's the sense that we get from that. No, that's a very deep argument, and unfortunately, just on the fly without a pen, I can't probably express it as well as I'd like to, but I think you get the idea.
That's okay. I think one of the keys to that too is if you look at the verbs, they're not strong verbs. They're simply things like lived. They're the past tense of to be.
Yeah.
There's nothing dynamic about the verbs. It's the stillness is partly created by verbs, and they're often a giveaway to literary style, as my literature students should well know. So there are a couple of questions there which I'm sure we can take, but we've got about 8 minutes in this time. So
I was just going to ask, how do you think that stillness or fits into the one text?
Oh, didn't I say that? It's a platform. So we see the stillness there, then we look at the amount of the raciness of the stream of consciousness scenes. And that gives the book a very diverse sense of narrative pace. And narrative pace is very important in making an enjoyable book. And in Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, we have to understand that Hemingway is an action man, and that in his work, form is almost as important as content. And if we really want to get an appreciation of these intense racy scenes, we have to understand how they're quite diverse, in that we have the still scene and we have the fast scene. That's how I'd say it. Yes?
But just even with this whole thing about unpacking how readers would, sort of read a specific passage, on how even with the stream of consciousness passage where you could identify between imaginative readers and squeamish readers, is that something that you could really see like markers going for?
Markers love it, but you have to be careful. You have to make sure that you can prove it empirically. So what I tend to do is I say when read aloud, because then they do read it aloud and they've read what you've written, and so they can't help but think about it as they're reading it out, and they think, maybe it was right.
Sort of exercise for them.
Yeah, it becomes an exercise for them. And plus, when you actually call the examiner to do something, I mean, they think, I just can't skim this one. I'm actually going to have to give it a bit of attention. And I guarantee things do get skim read. I'm sure it does happen.
That's why it's important to grab an assessor from the start with the quality of your introduction and insight, because they do have, like any human being when they're reading, they do have the option of zoning out a bit, don't they? And they're going to read a whole lot of stuff that isn't very good, and I'm sure yours will stand out immediately because there are things about it, but then you want to sustain that. You want to give them a good first impression, and then you want to show them that you've got angles that others aren't using. That's why I think that even that quote about even 7,000 died of it, if you can avoid using that, it would be great, because just about everybody will. I know it's a wonderful quote, but find something else that says what you want to use that for. To me, that's a quote about the cheapness of life, and about the hostility of the universe. You can find others about that in the text. So just be careful of that sort of thing, but look for the opportunities, as Jack says. And Jack was a real master of putting his own stamp on what he was doing with these insights. He met all the criteria, all of the core stuff was there, but then when you read his, and he got a 50 on the Tech Sack last year writing in this sort of style, it's in another zone really. It's got its own sort of uniqueness about it that attracts an assessor's attention immediately.
That's very flattering.
And true. I was one of the markers, was I not?
Yeah, you were.
I just wanted to just ask again about when you were talking about when the war is always distant. That also sort of been shown like in sort of the imagery we get of like the houses of things being destroyed and sort of left behind, like the southern interiors of the houses.
Yeah,
The action's never actually present. He sort of just observes it as a passing sort of thought.
Yeah, no, when he observes it like that though, like writes it more explicitly, it becomes so sort of stale and worthless. You know, like these sort of structures that man imposed upon the land, you know, housing, completely reduced to nothing by the wanton destructiveness of war. In fact, that's a great one, wanton destructiveness, if you ever want to get to, yeah, that's... I never used that one in Year 12 because I never worked out what wonton actually meant. I thought it was Chinese food. So, sort of just like angry without a premise, like.
And evil too. The famous quote from King Lear: "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods; they kill us for their sport." In Act 4, I think it is, Gloucester says it. It's that, and look, it's also the existentialist concept totally, that we are like the boy who gets a fly on his arm and we just randomly kill it. That's the existentialist universe, isn't it, in lots of ways? And so as flies to wanton boys, naughty, bad, had a slightly less powerful meaning in Shakespeare's day than it would have now. A wanton person is an evil person today, but it's a good expression, the wanton destructiveness. And just to come to that point, look, what Jack was talking about before in relationship to the characteristics of war, I think the words that I gave you at the start about the universe, can't all of those be applied to war as well? Isn't that the crossover zone? Isn't war random? Isn't it a hostile occupation? Can't it be deceptive? It's about tactics and hiding and camouflage. It's all those sorts of things that the universe is. So that's why the grand metaphor works so strongly, I think. It works more strongly for war than it does for love, because love is not presented in quite the same way. It's presented as a high-risk activity, but it's not presented with the specificity in terms of the existential connection that war is.
Yeah, and plus, we know that as much as I say that Hemingway is just about undecided about everything, he is slightly more resolved about war than he is about love. He really doesn't like things about the war. He kind of likes his soldier mates, but that's about it. And whereas in the love, it's very, very unsure, very unresolved. So.
And you've got to remember too that if he's writing this as a semi-autobiographical text, he actually had the bad experience of Agnes von Kurowski, the nurse that he actually met up with in Italy, eventually rejecting him. So he's got a whole lot of agenda as a writer, which is projected into the text, and then of course some aspects of it are fictionalized, but it is coming from a person's experience, and quite a few articles and scholars take up the aspect of this being his personal trauma narrative, that he still hasn't dealt with a lot of it. That's why it's a largely unreflective text. There's not a lot of interpretive commentary, and as I often say, it's much safer to stay with the narrative of events than it is to pause and interpret, because then the emotion would be too great. And the code hero isn't interested in that anyway. The code hero would rather remember the events than the emotional reactions to them.
So what would you say to like talking about those, like some of Hemingway's real life events, even if you just made it like the smallest allusion to it in your essay, would you say to talk about those real life events that occurred in
Not much.
Hemingway's
I
life?
wouldn't do much on it. I think if
Yeah.
you announce that it's a semi-autobiographical novel in your introduction, in your first sentence, that's great. Then if it depends on the topic, if you have one on narrative technique, then I think you've got to bring in the fact that this is a retrospective semi-autobiographical homodiegetic narrative. You've got to mention that sort of thing. Because the investment of the writer in events which actually happened to him, even though semi-fictionalized, is very great, isn't it? It's much more than a heterodiegetic omniscient narrator who's telling the story totally removed and knows everything about it. This is very different. This is a man reflecting on what happened to him, so he's got an investment at a different level. But he's also, to me, I understand the Frederick who's writing this story and narrating it from the moment closer to us than where the events took place, what I call Frederick II, is still a code hero. He's still not that interested in emotional investigation of what took place, emotional expression. He's still got all the hallmarks that he puts on Frederick I. It is the same person further down the track, but not with a lot of things resolved, I wouldn't have thought. And okay, he might still miss Catherine, but I think in terms of his present position as narrator and his loss of her in chapter 41, that his biggest fear is being alone. And therefore, when he prays to this absent God, he's praying not to be left alone. Because there was somebody who for a while seemed, this is the deceptive universe, seemed to fill the void, no longer does. And it's almost like a little boy saying, don't leave me alone anymore. That's to me the way that the novel concludes. And so the aloneness that he still feels, we don't know whether he's got a partner or anything else has happened. But writing from the perspective he writes from seems to suggest to me that not a lot has changed from the position he was in when he finished the story. Well, gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Jack for coming along today and his contribution.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it.
And by tomorrow, this will be on YouTube if you want to revisit it, or tell any other boys that it's been done. So also there are articles when you leave here. If you don't get them now, they'll be in the box outside my door downstairs. If you break the rules of this universe, which has much more power than you do, it will get you back. It's retributive. This universe makes trouble for you, therefore it is vexatious. And this universe paints some things out to be what they are not, and therefore it is deceptive. In Milan and in Switzerland, Frederick and Catherine think everything is fine, don't they? It's going to work out, it's going to be nice, going to have the baby, all this sort of thing. But there are constantly cracks through all of this. And they would like to believe that these periods in their life are going to last, but of course they don't. They're only being tricked by this universe into believing that. So it's deceptive. So that's just a little way of introducing this concept, because when people talk about existentialism in the text and they try to marry it with a definition they've read from an encyclopedia or Wikipedia or some other source, it doesn't always match exactly, does it? Because Hemingway's take is a particular one. But all existentialisms have to base themselves ultimately on the Okay, gentlemen, thanks for coming along. Most of you know Jack, but I do want to introduce him as an illustrious old boy who graced my own English class with his presence last year and his intellectual insight. So it's great to have him back. What I want to do at the start is just set the scene a bit, and then it's going to be pretty interactive, however you want it. Jack has got ideas on the text, and fortunately they're not all the same as mine. They mightn't be the same as yours. Feel free to come in anywhere, and it will be pretty organic. There'll be lots of good stuff on the text, but it will be a pretty organic discussion. The first thing I want to remind you of is the three things that you're doing between now and the exam. You're making sure you know the text well, knowledge of text. That means basically rereading it or listening to commentaries. The interpretive dimension of the text means reading articles, exemplary essays, or coming to sessions like this to tease out the ideas. Because isn't our understanding now that you know the text pretty well? You've got a pretty solid understanding of the text, which means that you can engage intellectually at a much more advanced level. And it's also good when people write articles, they've done the work for you. They've spent the time, all the pain, and we try to get it back to a good moment. So that's basically what the mechanics of life are if you take death as the end point. You've got to make the moment last and be enjoyable and less painful, because that's all there is. The moment you have is all there is. It will run out and you don't know when. So that's the first point, the overriding influence of death as the starting point. And the second thing is, well, just on that, you see how prominent death is at the start of the text, don't you? In a way, that's what Hemingway does. He says to you, right, we're starting with death. Only 7,000 died of it. That infamous quote is right there at the start to tell you this is where we begin our understanding of what it is to try to make meaning out of our existence. And then the other thing that it implies is an understanding of the cosmos, of the universe. And that therefore gives us cosmology in existentialism. And I'll just give you a couple of adjectives around it that I think come from the text, and you'll be able to make the connections. Firstly, what is the universe like, the one that we live in? It's hostile. It does not like us. Secondly, it's random. It has no plan. Things happen as they happen. You get blown up eating a piece of cheese for no apparent reason. You get suddenly made a war hero for no apparent reason. Gone aside, got their ideas together on a particular aspect of the text, and they've done it for you. So why reinvent the wheel? That's why I say these articles over here are available for you. And if you don't get that now, or you want to collect one later, they'll be outside the door of my office, in inverted commas, desk with a door adjacent to a passageway in reality. And thirdly, you're practicing your technique. You need to keep writing at this stage, I think. About a week out from the exam, you don't need to be pumping stuff out. But at this stage, still sharpening your skills. A lot of you will be doing more another practice exam. But writing introductions, perfecting body paragraphs, conclusions related to introductions, all that sort of thing is your technique. So the three ideas are text knowledge, interpretation of text, and your own technique. So clearly what we're doing today is we're in this zone of the interpretation. We're presuming a certain knowledge, not that you can't improve it. It's great to just go back randomly to pages or chapters. The chapters are all very manageable except 41, which is longer. So you've got that scope of being able to go back. I just want to set the discussion rolling, and then I'll hand over to Jack, around this idea of existentialism. Firstly, you have to understand that existentialism, like any ism, isn't one thing. It would be better if we talked about existentialisms. Everybody has his or her own take on the philosophy. So, Hemingway has a particular worldview which takes into account certain aspects of existentialism, and they come out through the text. How do we know at this stage, in 1929, what Hemingway is thinking as a younger man about the nature of the world, the universe, all the big issues of philosophy? We look in the text, we see the ideas. So I think there are a couple of key adjectives that keep emerging for me about the nature of his existentialism, which ties in with his cosmology, his view of the universe. I think the first thing to bear in mind is the significance of death. Because in a way, existentialists start at the end. They start at death and they work back, and that influences how they see their own existence. And I think if death is the end and there is nothing after it, then that means two things for us in life. If life is going well, we keep enjoying that and milking it for all it's worth. we make the good moment last, isn't it? And you can see that in Frederick's attitude. If life is going badly, we dull